2 weeks before graduation, my parents texted to say they were too exhausted from my sister's trip to fly out. I replied with 2 words: rest up. I never told them I was the student commencement speaker at Harvard. I let the cameras break the news instead. By noon the next day, their phones were exploding because the only empty chairs in the front row were the ones reserved for them. I am Isla Thomas, and exactly 14 days before I put on my cap and gown, my phone buzzed with the notification that would finally sever the tether. The message from my mother was short, breathless, and punctuated with a sad face emoji that felt more like a slap than an apology. She wrote that they were just too exhausted from Brielle's influencer trip to Cabo to make the flight up to Massachusetts. She said the jet lag was brutal. She said they needed to prioritize their health. I looked at the screen. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone across the room. I did not call them to beg, or to explain that this was not just a college graduation, but the culmination of 4 years of surviving without them. I simply typed 2 words: rest up. I hit send. I did not tell them that I was the student commencement speaker. I did not tell them that my face was going to be on the giant screens flanking the library steps. I did not tell them that the local news in our hometown would be carrying the live stream because a girl from our small West Virginia community had made it to the podium at Harvard. People ask me now if I hid it to be malicious. They ask if I was setting a trap. But the truth is far less cinematic and far more painful. I didn't tell them because I was tired. I was exhausted from the specific, heavy fatigue that comes from hoping people will change when they have shown you, over and over again, exactly who they are. If I had told them I was the speaker, they would have come, but they would not have come for Isla. They would have come for the photo opportunity. They would have come to stand next to the podium and smile for their Facebook friends, mining my achievement for their own social currency. So, I let them sleep, and I let the broadcast do the speaking. You have to understand the ecosystem I grew up in to understand why I did what I did next. My parents, David and Susan, are the pillars of their community. They are the people who organize the charity 5K runs and sit in the front pew at church. They live for the external validation of being a good family, but that image is a carefully curated performance, and for the last 5 years, the starring role has belonged to my younger sister, Brielle. Brielle is a star of the new age. Her life is measured in engagement metrics, brand deals, and aesthetic travel vlogs. She is not bad, but she is all-consuming. My parents ceased to be parents somewhere around her 16th birthday and transitioned into being her support staff. They are her managers, her photographers, and her luggage handlers. If Brielle has a crisis, the world stops. If Isla has a crisis, I'm told to be sensible and handle it. I handled it. I had 3 tickets allocated for the reserved family seating section, right in the front row where the VIPs and faculty guests sit. These are the seats the cameras sweep over when the speaker is announced. Most students fight for extra tickets. I had exactly enough for the people who mattered. Ticket number 1 was for Grandma June. She took a Greyhound bus for 18 hours to get here because she said she wouldn't trust an airplane not to lose her knitting needles. Ticket number 2 was for Tessa, my roommate, best friend, and the person who actually held my hair back when I got food poisoning during finals week. And ticket number 3? Ticket number 3 was for the ghost. I did not sell the 3rd ticket. I did not give it back to the university. I went to a local bodega on Cambridge Street and bought a bouquet of flowers. I didn't buy roses or lilies. I bought a $6 bundle of mixed carnations, the kind you buy when you forget a dinner party and need something last minute. I wrapped them in simple brown paper. This was not a funeral arrangement. I wasn't mourning them. I was marking a boundary. I took a piece of heavy cream cardstock and a thick black marker. I wrote 5 words, clear and bold, reserved for those who show up. The night before the ceremony, the dorms were vibrating with manic energy. Champagne corks were popping, and girls were crying in the hallways about leaving their friends. I sat at my desk with my speech printed out in front of me. The original draft had a section at the end. The standard thank you to the parents who sacrificed so much to get us here. I looked at those lines. They felt like a lie in my mouth. I took my red pen and I struck through the entire paragraph. I didn't want to mention them by name, even to shame them. Naming them gave them power. Naming them made them the protagonists of my story. Instead, I rewrote the ending. I focused on the concept of the empty chair. I wrote about the people who have to build their own tables because they were never invited to sit at the ones they were born into. The morning of graduation was blustery. The wind was whipping off the Charles River, carrying a chill that cut through the thin fabric of our gowns. The sky was a stark, aggressive blue. I walked to the reserved section early, before the crowds filled in. I hugged Grandma June, who looked regal in her Sunday hat. I high-fived Tessa, who was already holding a massive camera with a telephoto lens. Then, I placed the flowers on the third chair. I propped the card up against the bouquet. It looked stark against the folding chair. It looked deliberate. It was a visual scream in a sea of polite applause. As the ceremony began, I sat on the stage and watched the audience fill in. I saw families squeezing together, fathers adjusting their daughters' mortarboards, mothers crying into tissues. I felt a pang of that old familiar ache, but I pushed it down. I watched the camera boom sweep over the crowd. It lingered on the front row. It lingered on Grandma June. And then, it paused on the flowers. I saw the cameraman check his monitor. He zoomed in. The focus sharpened on the card. Reserved for those who show up. My phone was in my pocket. Silent. But I could feel the phantom vibration of what was to come. I knew exactly what was happening in West Virginia. I knew my parents would be sitting in their living room, perhaps with friends over, expecting to catch a glimpse of the ceremony on the news, oblivious to the fact that their daughter was the main event. They would be waiting to see if the camera caught a random shot of me in the crowd. When the dean introduced me, the air shifted. And now, our student speaker, graduating summa cum laude, Isla Thomas. I stood up. I walked to the podium. I adjusted the microphone. The wind blew a strand of hair across my face, and I tucked it back. I looked out at the thousands of faces, but I didn't really see them. I looked past them. I looked directly into the lens of the primary broadcast camera, the red tally light glowing like a target. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds. 5 seconds is a lifetime on television. The crowd quieted down. Sensing that this wasn't going to be a standard speech about chasing dreams and changing the world, I leaned into the mic. My voice didn't shake. It was steady, cold, and heavy with 22 years of being the second choice. If you have ever had to stare at an empty chair, I said, locking eyes with the lens, ensuring my parents would feel me staring right out of their television screen. Today, I am speaking for you. To understand why I let an empty chair speak for me at Harvard, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in a town in West Virginia where the population fits on a single welcome sign, and your reputation is worth more than your bank account. It is the kind of place where families are brands. You protect the brand at all costs. You smile at the grocery store. You volunteer for the bake sale. And you never, ever let anyone see the cracks in your drywall. My parents were masters of this. To the outside world, we were the perfect quartet. Inside the house, however, we were a trio and a spare part. The realization that I was the spare part did not hit me all at once like a lightning bolt. It arrived in a series of small, paper-cut moments that eventually bled me dry. The first deep cut happened on my 11th birthday. My birthday falls 3 days apart from the date my younger sister, Brielle, won the Little Miss Sunburst pageant. My parents decided it was simply more efficient to combine the celebrations. Efficiency was their love language, but only when it applied to me. The party was themed around sunshine and yellow sashes to honor Brielle's victory. There were 50 people in our backyard, neighbors and church friends, all fawning over Brielle in her tiara. When my mother brought out the cake, it was a towering lemon confection with bright yellow frosting. Written in script across the top was, "Congratulations, Brielle," and then, squeezed into the bottom corner in much smaller, cramped icing letters, was Isla. They had misspelled my name. When I pointed it out, my father laughed. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder and told the room that I was always so particular. always so serious. The guests laughed with him. They ate the cake. I remember staring at the slice on my paper plate, watching the incorrect letters of my name dissolve into the yellow cream, and realizing that to them, I was a typo. I was an administrative error in the schedule of their real life. Then came the gifts. For Brielle, they had purchased a high-end digital camera, the kind specifically designed for vlogging, because they said she had a natural light about her that needed to be captured. For me, my father reached into his briefcase and pulled out a black, vinyl-bound notebook. It had the logo of a pharmaceutical company stamped on the front in silver foil. It was free swag from a conference he had attended 2 months prior. He tossed it to me and said I could use it for my little drawings. I did not draw in it. That night, while Brielle was downstairs testing her new camera lens on the dog, I opened the corporate notebook to the first page. I wrote the date, August 14th. Underneath, I wrote 11th birthday. Dad gave me a free notebook. Mom forgot how to spell my name. That was the first entry. It would not be the last. As I moved through middle school and high school, I became the household utility player. I was the person you called when things broke, when the Wi-Fi router flashed red. My father would scream my name from the living room when the dishwasher clogged with food scraps because nobody else scraped their plates. My mother would find me doing homework and ask if I could just handle it. I was the tech support. I was the janitor. I was the invisible glue keeping their domestic convenience intact. But whenever I needed them to just be parents, the silence was deafening. Sophomore year, I won the regional academic decathlon. It was a rigorous competition involving math, literature, and economics. I had studied for 6 months, staying up until 2 a.m. with flashcards. The finals were held in the gymnasium of the county high school, just 20 minutes from our front door. I stood on the podium to accept the gold medal for the literature round. The principal asked the families of the winners to stand. I looked out into the bleachers. I saw my friend Tessa's parents waving a giant poster board. I saw grandmothers and uncles, and then I saw the 3 empty seats I had saved in the 3rd row. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I walked off the stage. It was a text from my mother. Running late. Brielle needs golden hour light for her spring collection photos. We will grab pizza later. They never came for pizza. They forgot. I walked home that day. It was raining. A slow, miserable drizzle that soaked through my blazer. When I got to the house, the lights were off. They were still out chasing the sun for Brielle. Grandma June was sitting on the porch swing, waiting for me. She didn't own a car, and she lived in the in-law suite above the garage. She was smoking a cigarette, a habit she refused to quit because she said she had outlived 3 doctors who told her to stop. She watched me walk up the driveway, wet and holding a medal that nobody wanted to see. She didn't offer me a towel. She didn't say everything would be okay. Grandma June didn't deal in comforting lies. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a heavy object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. She pressed it into my hand. It was a fountain pen. The barrel was chipped, and the brass was tarnished, but the nib was solid gold. She looked at me with eyes that were hard and clear. She told me that crying about who they were not would never change who they were. She said that if I did not like the way they were writing me out of the script, I had to grab the pen and write my own story. That night, I sat at my desk with the corporate notebook my father had given me years before. I opened it to a fresh page. I smoothed out the paper. I took Grandma June's pen and I began to write. I realized then that my parents were not evil. They were not villains from a fairy tale who locked me in a tower. They were simply people who had a limited capacity for attention, and they had spent their entire budget on one child. They were benignly neglectful. They thought that because I was fed and clothed and smart, I didn't need them. They assumed I was self-sustaining. So, I decided to prove them right. I stopped asking. I stopped leaving flyers for my school events on the kitchen counter. I stopped trying to explain why my debate tournaments mattered. When they asked how school was, I said it was fine. When they asked if I needed anything, I said I was good. I became a ghost in my own house. I moved silently. I studied. I worked. And every time they missed something, every time they chose a photo opportunity over my life. I opened the black notebook. December 12th, Christmas concert solo. Missed. Reason: Brielle had a callback for a shampoo commercial. March 4th, Science fair first prize. Missed. Reason: Dad had a golf tournament. Mom was editing Brielle's vlog. May 20th, Junior year parent-teacher conference. Missed. Reason: Forgot. The notebook began to fill up. Page after page of blue ink. It was no longer a diary of sadness. It was a dossier of evidence. It was a ledger of debts unpaid. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet. I just knew that I was storing up energy, like a battery left on the charger for too long. I was absorbing every slight, every absence, every empty chair. I was storing it all away, waiting for the day I would finally have enough power to light up the dark. By the time I reached the final semester of my senior year, the dynamic in our house had shifted from neglect to something sharper, something almost transactional. I had learned to monetize my pain, or at least to articulate it. I entered a statewide writing competition with an essay titled The Architecture of Silence. It was a brutal, clinical dissection of what it feels like to be the background noise in someone else's symphony. I didn't use real names, but I described the yellow cake with the misspelled name. I described the living room shrine to a sister whose talent was smiling at a ring light. When the local paper published it on the front page of the Sunday Lifestyle section, I left a copy on the kitchen island. I wanted a reaction. I wanted a fight. I wanted them to read it and realize that the ghost in the hallway had been taking notes. My mother found it while she was blending a kale smoothie for Brielle. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked up the paper. She read it standing up. I watched her eyes scan the columns, waiting for the flinch. It never came. That is very creative writing. Isla, she said, her voice flat and distracted. You have a vivid imagination. Then she dropped the paper into the recycling bin and turned back to the blender. We need to hurry. Brielle has a callback for a teen drama series in New York City on Tuesday, and we have to figure out if the drive is tax deductible. That was the moment the switch flipped. I realized I could scream fire in a crowded theater, and they would only complain about the noise interrupting their show. My guidance counselor, Mr. Abernathy, was the only person who saw the smoke. He called me into his office one rainy Tuesday and placed a stack of brochures on the desk. He told me that my grades and my extracurriculars were not just good. He said they were a ticket out. He told me I was applying to the Ivy League. And he wasn't asking. I did it all in the dark. I filled out the common application at 2 a.m. while the house was asleep. I hunted down my parents' tax returns from the filing cabinet in the den to fill out the financial aid forms. I wrote the essays during my lunch breaks, hiding in the library so no one would ask me why I wasn't helping Brielle with her lines. I chased down teachers for recommendations. I packaged myself, stamped myself, and shipped myself off into the ether without my parents ever knowing I had applied anywhere further than the local community college. The decision came on a Thursday in late March. I logged into the portal on my laptop, the screen refreshed, and confetti exploded digitally across the monitor. Congratulations. I did not scream. I did not run down the hall. I sat very still. It felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed shut for 18 years. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, my lungs filled all the way to the bottom. I was not just accepted, I was rescued. At dinner that night, I waited until Brielle had finished recounting her latest audition horror story. I got into Harvard. I said, the forks did not stop moving. My father chewed his steak. My mother looked up, blinking, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Harvard? She asked. As in, Massachusetts? Yes, I said. My father frowned. That is a long way away. Isla, why would you go 400 miles north when the state university is 40 minutes down the highway? You could live at home. You could save money. It wasn't about the money. We all knew that. It was about the utility. If I left, who would fix the router? Who would drive Brielle to the airport at 4 a.m? Who would be the audience? You know Brielle is going to need help with her brand launch this summer, my mother added, her voice taking on that familiar, guilt-inducing edge. We thought you could manage her social media. You are so good at writing. I looked at them. I looked at the people who had raised me, and I saw them not as parents, but as anchors, heavy, rusted anchors, trying to keep a ship in the harbor. I have a full scholarship. I lied. It wasn't full, not yet, but I would make it work. I am going. They didn't argue. They didn't forbid it. They just sighed, the way you sigh when a useful appliance breaks down and you know you have to replace it, to cover the gap in my tuition and the cost of moving. I took a job at the local hardware store. I spent my afternoons mixing paint and cutting keys. It was honest work. It was invisible work. While I was stocking shelves, my parents were holding court in the grocery store aisles, telling the neighbors about Brielle's potential big break. "Oh, Brielle is just flying," they would say, beaming. "And Isla?" the neighbors would ask. "Oh, Isla is working at the hardware store," my mother would reply, her voice dropping an octave. "She is saving up for school." They never mentioned Harvard. It was too abstract for them. It didn't have a follower count. 2 weeks before I was set to leave, Grandma June knocked on my bedroom door. She came in and sat on the edge of my bed. She handed me a small, red bank book. I opened it. It was a savings account in my name. The balance was $3,000. "I sold the Buick," she said. "I can't drive anymore anyway. My eyes are shot." "Grandma," I started. But she cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "This is not a gift, Isla. This is a getaway car. You take this money, and you do not look back. You do not ask them for a dime, because if you ask them for money, you give them permission to own you." I hugged her then. It was a fierce, desperate hug. She smelled of peppermint and old paper. That night, I made a new rule. I wrote it down in the black notebook, right under the entry about the missed graduation ceremony from middle school. The rule of one. I would invite them to exactly one thing per major life event. One graduation, one wedding, one ceremony. I would send the invite. I would give them the date. And if they did not show up, I would never ask again. I would not remind them. I would not beg. I would simply close the door. Harvard was not just a university to me. It was not just about the libraries or the prestige or the crimson sweatshirts. It was the training ground where I would learn the most important lesson of my life. It was the place where I would learn how to exist without needing their permission to breathe. I packed my bags 3 days early. I didn't leave a single thing behind in that house that I would have to come back for. I was traveling light, I was traveling fast, and I was traveling alone. I arrived in Cambridge with a suitcase that had a broken wheel and a schedule that would have made a CEO weep. Harvard is often painted in movies as a place of rowing crews and secret societies drinking sherry in mahogany rooms. For me, it was a landscape of survival. While my classmates were debating which ski resort to visit over winter break, I was clocking in at the Hawthorne Library Annex. It was a basement archive that smelled of dust and decaying paper, and it was perfect because nobody ever went down there. I worked the graveyard shift, scanning archival documents from 10 at night until 2 in the morning, listening to the hum of the ventilation system and calculating exactly how many hours of sleep I could afford before my 8 o'clock lecture. I was not alone in this trench warfare. My roommate was Tessa Grant, a girl from Chicago with hair cut sharp enough to draw blood and a personality to match. Tessa did not believe in sugarcoating reality. When I told her about my family situation during our first week, expecting the usual sympathetic head tilt, she just stared at me and opened her laptop. She said we needed a spreadsheet. She mapped out my tuition, my work-study hours, and my calorie intake like she was planning a military coup. Tessa was the first person in my life who did not offer me pity. She offered me strategy. By my sophomore year, I had caught the attention of Professor Marisol Vega. She was a titan in the Department of Public Health, a woman who looked at statistics and saw human stories. She didn't care about my pedigree or my lack of social connections. She cared that I could spot a pattern in a data set from a mile away. She pulled me into a project analyzing healthcare deserts in Appalachia. It was work that felt like surgery. We were dissecting the exact kind of systemic neglect that I had grown up in, turning the vague feeling of being forgotten into hard, undeniable numbers. I started winning things. First, it was a departmental research grant. Then, a prestigious fellowship for undergraduate analysis. For the first two events, I sent the dates to my parents. I sent the live stream links. I sent the directions to the campus. The seats remained empty. After the second time, I stopped sending the invites. I realized that hope is a heavy thing to carry when you are running a marathon, so I dropped it. The communication from home didn't stop, but it became a one-way broadcast about the golden child. My phone would light up with texts from my mother, but they were never questions about my classes or my health. They were press releases. Brielle just landed a brand partnership with a swimsuit line. Brielle is going to Tulum for a photo shoot. Make sure you go to Instagram and like her post. The algorithm is tricky today. I would be sitting in the library annex at midnight, eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets, and I would get a demand to boost my sister's engagement metrics. I did it. I double-tapped the screen. It was the tax I paid to keep the peace. By junior year, I wasn't just analyzing data anymore. I was building, under Professor Vega's guidance. I developed an analytic model designed to help nonprofits optimize how they distributed medical supplies to rural clinics. It was efficient, it was scalable, and it was completely unglamorous. It was the kind of work that doesn't look good on Instagram, but actually saves lives. A major philanthropic fund picked it up for a pilot program. It was a massive win. I was 21 years old, and I had created something that mattered. I didn't tell my parents. One evening, Tessa was sitting on her bed, scrolling through her phone with a frown that deepened by the second. She looked up at me. She asked if I knew that my mother had started a blog about raising successful daughters. I felt a cold drop in my stomach. I said I didn't know. Tessa turned the screen toward me. There was a photo of my parents and Brielle, dressed in coordinating white linen, laughing on a beach. The caption was a 500-word essay about the sacrifices of parenthood and the joy of watching your children fly. It was tagged with words like family first and proud mom. Tessa scrolled down. She went back 3 years. She looked at every holiday post, every birthday shout-out, every vacation update. She looked at me and said that I wasn't there. It wasn't just that they posted more about Brielle. It was that they had curated a digital reality where I ceased to exist. To their followers, to the community that validated them, they were a family of 3. I was a glitch that they had edited out in post-production. They loved the idea of a family, but I didn't fit the aesthetic. I was too serious, too far away, too much work to explain. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. A strange, icy calm settled over me. It was the feeling of a fever finally breaking. For years, I had been reacting to them. I had been hurt, then angry, then disappointed. I had been playing my part in their drama, even if my role was the tragic extra. But looking at that screen, I went cold, and that coldness made me dangerous. I realized I didn't need to fight them. I just needed to stop playing the game. I stopped responding to the texts about Brielle's engagement ratios. When they called to talk about themselves, I let it go to voicemail. I stopped offering updates. I became exactly what they had portrayed me as. I became nothing. The silence from my end seemed to unnerve them, but I didn't care. I was busy. Then, 2 months before graduation, the email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple: Commencement Speaker Finalist Interview. I stared at the screen. To be the student speaker at Harvard is not just an honor. It is a microphone given to one person to define the experience of thousands. It is the kind of thing that parents rent billboards for. It is the ultimate validation. Professor Vega had nominated me. She had written a letter of recommendation that made me sound like a warrior. I read the invitation again. I knew that if I got this, if I actually stood on that podium, it would be impossible to hide. It would be big. I also knew that if I told my parents now, they would be on the first flight to Boston. They would not come to hear me. They would come to be seen hearing me. They would come to claim the victory as a result of their parenting. I hit reply. I accepted the interview, and then I closed my laptop and went back to work on my data model. I didn't send a text to the family group chat. I didn't post a cryptic status update. I kept it locked inside my chest, a secret that was burning hotter by the day. They wanted an invisible daughter. I decided I would stay invisible, right up until the moment I became the most visible person in the world. The email that confirmed it did not come with fanfare. It arrived in my inbox on a rainy Tuesday morning while I was brushing my teeth. The subject line was Standard Administrative Bureaucracy. Commencement Speaker Selection Committee. Final Decision. I tapped it open with a thumb still covered in toothpaste foam. There it was. I was the one. The message went on to detail the logistics. I would be speaking not just to the graduating class of the college, but to the alumni, the faculty, and the families. It also mentioned that for the first time in a decade, the ceremony would be broadcast live by Common State Public Media, a regional network that syndicated to affiliates all over the East Coast. It wasn't CNN, but it was big enough that anyone with an internet connection or a basic cable package could watch it. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but I forced myself to finish brushing my teeth. I rinsed my mouth. I looked in the mirror. I looked like the same girl who fixed Wi-Fi routers and filled out financial aid forms in the dark, but I wasn't her anymore. The next email from the committee was a request for logistics. Please list the names of family members requiring VIP seating in the reserved section. The form read, Limit 3. I sat at my desk. The cursor blinked in the first field. I typed June Thomas. That was easy. Grandma June would be there if she had to walk. In the second field, I typed Tessa Grant. Tessa wasn't family by blood, but she was the only reason I had eaten a vegetable in the last 4 years. Then the cursor moved to the third line. I stared at it. The white space felt vast. I could put my parents' names there. I could call them right now, tell them the news, and listen to the sudden shift in their tone. I could give them the chance to be the parents they claim to be on Facebook. I could fix this. I had the power to fix this right now, but fixing it would mean erasing the last 10 years. It would mean pretending that the silence hadn't happened. I left the third line blank. I hit submit. In the library. My phone buzzed with the excuse I'd been expecting. Hey, honey, my mother wrote. We can't make it. We're exhausted. We need to prioritize our health. Send us pictures. I read it twice. Same script, different day. The click in my chest came anyway. I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold, hard click in my chest, like a lock snapping shut. The last vestige of hope. That tiny, stupid child inside me who thought maybe this time. Finally curled up and went to sleep. I typed 2 words. Rest up. I put the phone down. Tessa was sitting across from me, highlighting a tort law textbook. She saw my face. She didn't ask what the text said. She knew. You could still tell them, she said quietly. She wasn't pushing me. She was just laying the option on the table. You could call them and say, hey, turn on the TV on Thursday because I'm the main event. They would get on a plane tonight if they knew. I looked at her. They know how to find what they want. I said, they found a way to show up for Brielle. They found a way to every one of Brielle's showcases since she was 5. If they wanted to find me, I haven't exactly been hiding. Tessa nodded. She closed her highlighter. Okay then, she said. The day before the ceremony, I went to the florist on Brattle Street. I didn't want a pre-made arrangement. I walked into the walk-in cooler, the air smelling of wet earth and crushed stems. I took my time. I chose white hydrangeas first, because they were Grandma June's favorite. She always said they were honest flowers because they didn't try to be fancy. They just took up space. Then I found it, a single, deep red dahlia. It was the exact shade of crimson that the university used on its banners. It was dark, almost black at the center, and it looked less like a flower and more like a drop of blood. I had the florist wrap them in simple butcher paper. When I got back to the dorm, I took out a piece of thick cardstock. I didn't use a ballpoint pen. I used a black marker with a chiseled tip. I wrote the words slowly, making sure the lines were perfectly vertical. reserved for those who show up. I looked at the card. It looked like a verdict. It wasn't messy or emotional. It was a statement of fact. That night, the dorm was loud with people packing and saying goodbye, but my room was quiet. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the door. I was wearing my pajamas, but in my head, I was already in the robe. I practiced the opening of the speech. I didn't recite the whole thing. I just focused on the hook, the part that mattered. There are people who build tables, I whispered to my reflection, and there are people who leave empty chairs. We are taught that an empty chair is a tragedy, but I am here to tell you that an empty chair is also a lesson. I stopped. I had debated for weeks whether to use their names, whether to say David and Susan Thomas didn't come today, but I realized that would be petty. It would make the moment about them. And this wasn't about them. This was about the silence they had left behind, and how I had filled it with my own voice. I wasn't going to defame them. I was just going to turn on the lights. If the light revealed that their seats were empty, that was not my doing. That was their architecture. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I watched the numbers on my digital clock change. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. At 5:30, the sky outside my window began to turn a bruised purple. Dawn was coming. The day was here. I got up. The room was cold. I pulled my graduation gown out of the plastic bag. It rustled in the silence. I put it on over my dress. I zipped it up. I looked at the velvet stripes on the sleeves. My phone sat on the nightstand. It was black and silent. No good luck texts. No, "We are so proud of you" messages. Just the stillness of a device that connected me to people who had disconnected themselves years ago. I picked it up and slipped it into the deep pocket of my gown. I looked out the window at the sunrise bleeding over the brick buildings of the yard. I knew that in a few hours, that silence was going to break. I knew that once common state public media started broadcasting, and once that camera found that empty chair, my phone was going to start ringing. I took a deep breath, let it ring. The air in Tercentenary Theater was thick with humidity and the collective anxiety of 30,000 people. It was a sea of crimson and black, a shifting tide of mortarboards and proud parents clutching bouquets of overpriced roses. Everywhere I looked, there were families. Fathers were adjusting ties, mothers were wiping lipstick off cheeks, and siblings were holding up homemade signs with glitter glue lettering. It was a chaotic, beautiful mess of connection. And then there was my row. Section A, Row 4. It was prime real estate, reserved for the families of the platform party. In the middle of the chaos, there was a pocket of stillness. Grandma June was there, sitting with a posture that could have been carved from granite. She wore her best Sunday hat, a navy blue thing with a small veil that didn't quite hide the fierce pride in her eyes. Next to her was Tessa, armed with a camera lens long enough to photograph a bird on the moon. And between them sat the void. The chair I had reserved for my parents was not just empty, it was loudly, aggressively vacant. The bouquet of white hydrangeas and the single deep red dahlia sat on the seat, looking less like a gift and more like a memorial. Propped against the stems was the card. The black marker text was stark against the cream paper, reserved for those who show up. I sat on the stage, watching the monitor that showed the broadcast feed. The director was cutting between shots of the dean speaking and sweeping pans of the crowd. I saw the camera linger on a crying mother in the third row. I saw it catch a father giving a thumbs up. Then they called my name, Isla Thomas. The sound of it over the loudspeakers felt foreign, like someone else's life. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, not with fear, but with the weight of the moment. I walked to the podium. The wood was cool under my hands. I adjusted the microphone. I looked out at the ocean of faces, blurring into a single entity of expectation. I did not start speaking immediately. I took a breath, and then, with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making the first incision, I looked down. I did not look at the teleprompter. I did not look at the dean. I looked directly at row 4. I held my gaze there. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. It was just enough time. I saw the red tally light on the main camera swing toward me. following my eyes. The director, sensing the tension, cut to the shot of what I was looking at. The giant screens flanking the library steps suddenly filled with the image of Grandma June, Tessa, and the empty chair with its bouquet and card. The image was sharp, high definition. You could read every letter on the card. Reserved for those who show up. I looked back up, straight into the lens, and I began. Some of us grow up learning to sit next to an empty chair. I said. My voice did not waver. It was clear, amplified across the yard and beamed out to every affiliate station on the East Coast. The rustling in the crowd stopped. The ambient noise of thousands of people shifting in their seats vanished. We are told that an empty chair is a failure. I continued. We are told that if we were enough, if we were louder, or brighter, or more successful, the chair would be filled. We spend our childhoods auditioning for the attention of people who are already looking away. I saw Grandma June on the monitor. She reached out a gloved hand and rested it gently on the bouquet. It was a small, instinctive gesture of comfort, as if she were holding the hand of the ghost that should have been sitting there. The camera zoomed in on her hand and the card. It was an image so heavy with unsaid things that I heard a collective intake of breath from the front rows. But today, I want to talk about the architecture of that silence. I said, I want to talk about the invisible labor of the people who do show up, the ones who fix the Wi-Fi, the ones who fill out the forms in the dark, the ones who build their own tables because they were never invited to the dinner party. We are the architects of our own presence. We do not need permission to exist, and we certainly do not need to beg for a seat at our own graduation. I spoke for 10 minutes. I talked about discipline as a form of self-love. I talked about the dignity of doing the work when no one is watching. I did not mention my parents by name. I did not have to. The empty chair was screaming their names louder than I ever could. When I delivered the final line, build your own house, and fill it with people who know how to stay, there was a second of absolute silence. Then, the yard erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar. Students were standing up. Parents were wiping their eyes. I stepped back from the podium, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked one last time at the empty chair. The flowers were still there, bright and unmoving. I walked back to my seat. My hands were shaking now. I sat down and smoothed my gown over my knees. I could feel the vibration of my phone in the deep pocket of my robe. It started as a single buzz, then another. Then it became a continuous, angry hum against my thigh. I did not look. I kept my eyes forward, watching the next speaker approach the mic, but I could not hear a word he was saying. The world had narrowed down to the buzzing in my pocket. After the ceremony, the crowd was a crush of bodies. I found Tessa and Grandma June near the library steps. Tessa looked pale. She was holding her phone like it was a live grenade. "Isla," she said, her voice tight. "You need to see this." She turned the screen toward me. It was a clip of my speech. Specifically, the moment I paused and looked at the chair, followed by the zoom in on the card. The caption read, "Harvard speaker leaves empty seat for parents who did not show." Chills. It had 70,000 views, and the counter was spinning so fast the numbers were blurring. "It is trending," Tessa whispered. "It is on Twitter. It is on TikTok. A reporter from the Boston Globe just sent me a direct message asking who the chair was for." My phone buzzed again in my hand. I looked down at the screen. Mom calling, I let it ring. The screen went dark. Dad calling, I stared at it. The screen went dark. Brielle calling, and then a number I did not recognize, with a Washington, D.C., area code. The silence I had lived with for 22 years was gone. It had been replaced by a noise so loud it was going to shatter everything. I looked at Grandma June. She just adjusted her hat and smiled a grim, satisfied smile. "Well," she said, "I guess they are awake now." I looked at the phone as it lit up again. Mom calling, I slid the phone back into my pocket without answering. Let them leave a voicemail. I had a graduation lunch to get to. The chaos did not wait for the reception. It began before I had even handed back my rental gown. My phone, which I had finally pulled out of my pocket, was no longer a device for communication. It was a detonator. The missed calls were stacking up like planes over a fogged-in airport. 17 from my mother, 12 from my father, and a barrage of texts that scrolled so fast I couldn't read them individually. When I finally unlocked the screen, the tone wasn't hurt. It wasn't the sorrowful plea of parents who had missed a milestone. It was panic. Pure, unadulterated damage control. "Why didn't you tell us there were cameras?" My mother's text read, "Mrs. Gable just called. She saw the live stream. Everyone is asking why the chair was empty. Call me, now." My father's voicemail was even more telling. "Isla, pick up the phone. This is getting out of hand. People are commenting on the church Facebook page. You need to explain that we were sick. You need to fix this narrative immediately. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the brand." Then came Brielle. Her message was a masterclass in narcissism. "You are making me look like a villain," she wrote. "My engagement is tanking because people are spamming my comments with snake emojis. Thanks a lot." 10 minutes later, I watched her Instagram story update. It was a photo of us from 5 years ago, heavily filtered. The caption read, "So proud of my big sister graduating from Harvard today. Wish we could have been there, but family emergencies happen. Sending all my love to the smartest girl I know. Proud sister Harvard family first." I showed the screen to Tessa. She snorted so hard she nearly choked on her champagne. "She is trying to put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole," Tessa said, "and she is using a filter to do it." By the time we got back to the dorm to pack the last of my boxes, the local news in West Virginia had picked up the story. It wasn't the headline news, but it was the kind of human interest piece that spreads like wildfire in small towns. They played the clip of me staring at the empty chair, the anchor, a woman who had interviewed my parents dozens of times for their charity drives. Looked into the camera and asked the question that was now on everyone's lips, a moving tribute to the invisible struggles of students. She said, "But it leaves us wondering whose seat was that? And where were they?" The phone calls to my parents were not stopping. I could imagine the scene in their living room, the landline ringing, the cell phones buzzing, the neighbors, the church choir director, the people who donated to their annual food drives. They were all calling to ask for an explanation. My parents, who had built their entire identity on showing up for the community, were suddenly being exposed for not showing up for their own daughter. But the real blow didn't come from the gossip mill. It came via email at 4 p.m. I was folding a sweater when a notification popped up on my laptop. It was from a sender I didn't recognize. Mark S. Wallace, Senior Investigative Reporter, the Charleston Gazette-Mail. I clicked it open. "Dear Ms. Thomas," it began. "Congratulations on your graduation. Your speech was powerful. I am writing because the discussion around your family's absence has raised some interesting questions regarding the Thomas Community Promise Fund that your parents administer. We have received tips suggesting that the fund's travel expenses have been significant over the last 3 years. Given that you mentioned invisible labor and building your own table, I was wondering if you would be willing to speak on the record about the fund's allocation of resources." I stared at the screen. The Thomas Community Promise Fund. It was a small nonprofit my parents had started 5 years ago to help underprivileged youth in our county attend extracurricular activities. They were the directors. Brielle was the face of it. I turned the laptop toward Tessa. "Read this," I said. Tessa read it. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't say a word. She just opened a new tab on her browser. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Public records," she said. "Nonprofits have to file tax forms. Form 990 is public information if you know where to look." She typed furiously for 5 minutes. I watched her face go from curious to cold. "Isla," she said, "look at the travel and meetings line item." I looked. In the last fiscal year, the fund had spent $42,000 on travel, conferences, and meetings. Tessa opened a second window. She pulled up Brielle's Instagram feed. She scrolled back to last July. "Here is Brielle in Miami for swim week," Tessa said. She pointed to the date, July 12th to July 16th. Then she switched back to the tax form. She pointed to an entry in the ledger. July 12th, Outreach Conference, Miami, expense, $4,800. My stomach dropped. It felt like I was in a free fall. Scroll up, I said. Look at the trip to New York for Fashion Week in September. Tessa scrolled. September 8th, Donor Relations Meeting, New York City. Expense, $6,200. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a pattern. My parents weren't just skipping my events because they preferred Brielle. They were funding Brielle's career, her flights, her hotels, her networking dinners, using money that was supposed to buy soccer cleats and violin lessons for poor kids in West Virginia. Grandma June was sitting in the corner armchair, knitting. She stopped. She looked at us over her glasses. I gave them $5,000 for that fund last Christmas, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I asked your father last month where the quarterly report was. He told me the accountant was behind schedule. She put her knitting down. The needles clicked against the table. I always wondered how they could afford all those trips, she whispered. David has a hardware store. Susan teaches piano part-time. The math never worked, but I didn't want to see it. The phone rang again. It was my mother. I put it on speaker. Isla, she practically screamed. You have to post something. Now, write a status saying we had a medical emergency. Say we were in the hospital. People are starting to ask about the fund. Isla, they are asking why we were in LA last week if we were too sick to come to Boston. Her voice was high and thin with terror. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for an alibi. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating. Isla, are you there? Dad says he will pay off your student loans if you fix this. Just post the statement. I looked at Tessa. I looked at Grandma June. I am not posting anything. I said, Isla, don't you dare. I hung up. I walked over to my desk and pulled out the black notebook, the one I had kept since I was 11, the one that documented every missed birthday, every skipped ceremony, every excuse. I opened it to the page from 3 years ago. May 10th, missed state debate finals. Reason, Brielle had a modeling convention in Atlanta. I looked at Tessa. Can you check the fund expenses for May 10th? 3 years ago? Tessa typed. May 10th, Youth Leadership Summit. Atlanta, expense, $3,500. I turned the page. November 3rd, missed Thanksgiving. Reason, Brielle had to go to Nashville for a music video shoot. Tessa checked. November 3rd, Community Outreach Strategy Meeting, Nashville. Expense, $2,900. It was all there. My notebook wasn't just a diary of teenage angst anymore. It was a forensic timeline. Every time they had told me they were too busy, too tired, or too broke to show up for me, they had been billing the community for a trip to make Brielle a star. I closed the notebook. The cover felt cool under my fingers. The empty chair at my graduation hadn't just exposed their absence. It had cracked open the door to a vault they thought was sealed tight. And now, I held the combination, the morning after graduation. I did not go to a celebratory brunch. I went to the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. I sat across from a third-year law student named Marcus, who looked at the spreadsheet Tessa and I had compiled with the skepticism of someone who had seen too many family disputes turn into lawsuits. I needed to know where the line was. I needed to know the difference between telling my story and inviting a defamation suit from the people who gave me my last name. Marcus pushed his glasses up his nose and tapped the stack of papers. He told me that truth is the absolute defense against defamation. He said that if I could prove the overlap between the public tax filings of the nonprofit and the public geolocation tags of my sister's social media. I wasn't making an accusation, I was stating a fact. He warned me that this wasn't just a family spat anymore, it was approaching the territory of forensic accounting. He told me to be careful, not because I was wrong, but because people who are cornered tend to bite. I walked out of that office with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. I didn't want a public relations war. I didn't want to fight them in the comments section of Facebook or through vague Instagram stories. I wanted to look them in the eye. Back at the apartment, Tessa and I turned my living room into a war room. We taped 3 long sheets of butcher paper to the wall. We created 3 distinct timelines, color-coded for clarity. The first line, in black ink, was my life. It listed every major event my parents had missed over the last 4 years. The debate finals, the research symposium, the awards dinner, my graduation. The second line, in pink ink, was Brielle's career. It tracked her location based on her public posts: Los Angeles, Miami, New York, Nashville. It included the dates of her photo shoots, her brand activation parties, and her networking dinners. The third line, in green ink, was the money. This was the data we had pulled from the Public Form 990 tax filings of the Thomas Community Promise Fund. We listed the dates of every expense categorized as outreach travel, donor development, or conference fees. When we stepped back, the pattern wasn't just visible, it was glaring. The lines didn't just run parallel, they intersected with mathematical precision. I pointed to a date from 2 years ago, October 14th. My parents had missed my induction into the Honor Society because they claimed my father had a severe flu. I looked at the pink line. On October 14th, Brielle had posted a photo from a rooftop bar in Austin, Texas, with the caption, "South by Southwest vibes." I looked at the green line. On October 14th, the fund had charged $3,200 for Educational Tech Conference, Austin. We went down the list. The medical outreach trip to Miami coincided perfectly with Miami Swim Week. The urban planning seminar in New York aligned exactly with Fashion Week. There were 19 instances in 3 years. 19 times they had claimed to be working for the community. 19 times they had used donor money, money from our neighbors, from the church collection plate, from Grandma June's pension, to fund Brielle's attempt at fame. I felt a strange detachment as I looked at the wall. I wasn't hurt. I was past hurt. I was an auditor looking at a fraudulent ledger. The parents I had grieved for didn't exist. They were essentially embezzlers who had used my neglect as a cost-saving measure. I sat down on the floor and opened a new message on my phone. I added my mother, my father, and Brielle to the group chat. I typed a single message. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock in the evening, my apartment, no phone calls, no lawyers. Come if you want to hear the truth. My phone lit up almost instantly. My father was the first to reply. Is this a threat, Isla? You are treading on dangerous ground. My mother followed a second later. We are your parents. You don't summon us. I didn't engage in the emotional bait. I didn't explain. I simply replied, no, this is me stopping the explanations. I spent the next day preparing. I didn't want the chaotic energy of a dorm room. I cleaned my small sublet in Somerville until it smelled of lemon and discipline. I went to the grocery store and bought ingredients for a simple pasta dish. I wasn't cooking to nourish them. I was cooking to occupy my hands. When I set the table, I didn't leave an empty chair this time. That phase was over. The empty chair was a symbol of my waiting, and I was done waiting. I set 4 places. I wanted them to sit. I wanted them to be trapped in the furniture of my life, forced to look at the daughter they had erased. Grandma June arrived at 6 o'clock. She didn't say much. She walked over to the wall where the timelines were still taped up. She put on her reading glasses and stood there for a long time, tracing the green line with a trembling finger. When she turned back to me, her face was hard. She told me she wasn't staying for dinner. She said she would sit in the armchair by the window. She said she was there to be a witness, not a participant. She wanted to see if they could look her in the eye. At 6:45, I printed the documents. I made 3 copies of everything. The first document was a typed version of my black notebook. It was the emotional timeline, the missed birthdays, the forgotten awards, the text saying too tired or too busy. The second document was the financial analysis. It was a spreadsheet. It had columns for dates, locations, expenses, and Brielle's corresponding Instagram posts. It was dry, boring, and utterly damning. It looked like an invoice for a stolen childhood. I stacked the papers in the center of the table, next to the water pitcher. The printer was still cooling down, giving off that distinct smell of warm toner. At 7 o'clock exactly, there was a knock at the door. It was a heavy, authoritative knock, the kind of knock that expects the door to open immediately. I took a breath. I smoothed down my shirt. I walked to the door and unlocked it. My father stepped in first. He was wearing his community leader suit, the one he wore to city council meetings when he wanted to intimidate the zoning board. He didn't look at me. He looked past me, scanning the apartment as if assessing the property value. My mother followed him. She was clutching her oversized designer handbag against her chest like a shield. Her eyes were darting around the room, landing on the simple furniture, the peeling paint on the windowsill, and finally, on Grandma June, sitting like a stone statue in the corner. Brielle came in last. She was wearing sunglasses, even though it was evening. She kept her head down, and before she even stepped fully inside, she held up her phone and scanned the room, checking for hidden cameras. She looked terrified. Not of me, but of the lens. She was so used to performing that she couldn't imagine a scenario where the cameras weren't rolling. I closed the door. The lock clicked. The sound was final. "Welcome." I said, "Please, sit down." The silence in my apartment was not peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a submarine deep underwater, where the hull groans under the weight of the ocean. We sat around the small dining table. My father cut his pasta with aggressive precision. My mother moved food around her plate without lifting the fork to her mouth. Brielle sat with her arms crossed, her sunglasses finally on the table, staring at the wall as if she were waiting for a director to yell cut. I took a sip of water. The glass was cool against my palm. I set it down. The sound echoed like a gavel strike. "I grew up next to an empty chair," I said. My voice was low and even. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. I was simply reporting the weather. And I stopped waiting for someone to sit in it a long time ago. My mother flinched. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wet. "Isla, please, we are here. We are eating dinner. Can we just move past the dramatics?" I reached for the stack of papers in the center of the table. I picked up the first document, the typed transcript of my black notebook. December 12th, 2018. I read, "Christmas concert solo. You texted, 'Good luck, have fun.' You were in Atlanta for a modeling showcase. I looked at them. They didn't speak. March 4th, 2019. Science fair first prize. You texted, 'Great job. You were in Nashville for a music video shoot.' I flipped the page. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. May 20th, 2020. Junior year parent-teacher conference. Missed. You texted, 'Forgot.' My mother's hand started to tremble. She reached for her wine glass, but she didn't drink. She just held the stem, her knuckles white. She was used to my silence. She was used to my compliance. She was not prepared for my data. Hearing the neglect read back to her as a list of dates and timestamps stripped away the emotional fog she usually hid behind. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a calendar of choices. "You are being unfair," my father said, his voice booming slightly, trying to regain control of the room. "We did the best we could. You were always so self-sufficient. Isla, you didn't need us the way Brielle did. You were independent." I looked him dead in the eye. "Independence is not a personality trait, Dad," I said. "Independence is a consequence. It is what happens when you realize that if you fall, no one is going to catch you. It is a survival mechanism, not a compliment." Brielle slammed her hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "Stop it," she hissed. "You are just trying to make me look like the villain. You humiliated us in front of the whole world yesterday. You made us look like monsters. Do you know what people are saying in my comments? They are calling me a parasite." I looked at my sister. Her face was flushed, her perfect makeup cracking under the strain of reality. "I didn't humiliate anyone. Brielle," I said, "I just let the camera see what was actually there. I stopped covering for you. If the truth looks like a monster, that is not my fault." I picked up the second document, the spreadsheet, the one with the green and pink lines. I slid it across the table toward my father. "And speaking of parasites," I said, Let us talk about the funding. My father looked down at the paper. I watched his face change. The bluster, the arrogance, the community leader mask. It all dissolved into a pale, gray fear. He recognized the format immediately. He knew exactly what those columns meant. "What is this?" he whispered. "It is a comparison," I said, "between the travel expenses of the Thomas Community Promise Fund and Brielle's Instagram location tags." My mother gasped. She snatched the paper from the table. Her eyes scanned the rows. 19 matches. 19 times you used donor money to pay for Brielle's career. "That is an accounting error," my mother said quickly, her voice high and breathless. "We will fix it. It was just, we got the credit cards mixed up. It happens. We pay it back. It has happened 19 times over 3 years. Mom," I said, "that is not a mix-up. That is a system." Then, something shifted in Brielle's face. She looked from the paper to our parents. She reached out and took the sheet from our mother's shaking hands. She read the entry for New York Fashion Week. She read the amount. $6,200. "Wait," Brielle said. Her voice was small. "You told me the brand paid for that trip. You told me the agency covered the flight and the hotel." My parents didn't answer. My father stared at his pasta. My mother looked at the floor. "You told me I earned that trip." Brielle's voice rose, cracking. "You said they flew me out because they wanted me. You paid for it? With the charity money?" Brielle wasn't angry about the ethics. She was devastated by the reality. She had believed her own hype. She thought she was a star who commanded all expenses-paid trips. Discovering that her parents had been embezzling money to fund her lifestyle meant she wasn't a prodigy. She was a project. She was a fraud. "I didn't know," Brielle whispered, looking at me. "Isla, I swear, I thought I was booking these jobs." I believed her. That was the tragedy of it. She was just as much a victim of their delusion as I was. They had created a fantasy world where she was famous and I was invisible. And they had stolen from the poor to pay for the set design. "Why?" I asked. I looked at my mother. "Why did you do it? Why was it so important to prop her up that you had to erase me?" My mother looked up. There were tears in her eyes now. Real ones. "Because you were winning anyway," she said softly. Her voice was broken. "You were always winning. Isla, the grades, the awards. You didn't need help, but Brielle needed to feel special. We were scared." "Scared of what?" I asked. "Scared that if we didn't help her, you would eclipse her," she confessed. "In a small town, there is only so much spotlight. We didn't want you to make her feel small, so we made you smaller." The room went dead silent. The confession hung in the air like smoke. They hadn't ignored me because they didn't love me. They had ignored me because my success threatened the narrative they were building for my sister. They had handicapped me to make the race look fair. From the corner of the room, the armchair creaked. Grandma June stood up. She walked over to the table. She leaned down, placing her hands flat on the wood. She looked at her son and her daughter-in-law with a gaze that could have stripped paint from the walls. "You are pathetic," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was terrified. "You didn't raise 2 daughters. You raised an image, and you sacrificed a human being to feed a ghost." She turned to me. "Finish it, Isla." I looked at them. My father was slumped in his chair, defeated. My mother was weeping into her hands. Brielle was staring at the spreadsheet as if it were an autopsy report of her career. I reached into my bag and pulled out a large manila envelope. "This contains copies of everything," I said. "The timeline, the social media posts, the tax filings." I placed it on the table. "I am not going to the police tonight," I said, "and I am not posting this on the internet." My father looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "But I am sending a digital copy of this file to the board of directors of the Thomas Community Promise Fund in 48 hours, I continued. Unless what?" my father asked. "Unless you self-report." I said, "You call the board tomorrow morning. You admit to the misuse of funds. You pay back every single cent. Even if you have to sell the house, you step down from the leadership and you issue a public statement apologizing to the community. Not to me, To the people you stole from, but that will ruin us. My mother sobbed. We will be pariahs. You are already ruined, I said coldly. The only question is whether you want to be ruined and honest, or ruined and in prison. I stood up. I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway light spilled in, harsh and bright. You have 48 hours, I said. After that, I stop protecting you from the consequences of your own architecture. They stood up, slowly, like old people. My father took the envelope. He didn't look at me. My mother tried to touch my arm as she passed, but I stepped back. Brielle stopped in the doorway. She looked at me, her sunglasses in her hand, her eyes red and swollen. I am sorry, she whispered, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't acting. Then she walked out. I closed the door. I locked it. I turned around and looked at the empty plates, the uneaten pasta, and the 3 chairs that were now. Finally, just furniture, the 48-hour deadline came and went, not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating rustle of paperwork. My parents did what they had to do. They self-reported to the board. It was not a noble act of contrition. It was a calculated move to avoid a criminal investigation, a desperate attempt to control the narrative before the narrative controlled them. The fallout in our small West Virginia town was immediate. It wasn't the loud, explosive gossip of a scandal. It was the low, murmuring hum of betrayal. People weren't talking about affairs or secret families. They were talking about ledgers. They were talking about the bake sales they had organized and the $5 bills they had stuffed into envelopes. Realizing now that those donations hadn't gone to after-school programs, they had gone to the Delta airline counter. The board asked my parents to step down temporarily pending a full external audit. Temporarily was the polite word they used in the press release. Everyone knew it was permanent. The Thomas Community Promise Fund was frozen. 3 days after the news broke, my mother called me. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual performative cheer. She asked if I would post a statement. She wanted me to say that I supported them, that we were working through this as a family, that it was all a complex misunderstanding of tax law. She wanted the Harvard graduate daughter to be the character witness who could save their reputation. I held the phone to my ear, looking out at the Charles River. I am not destroying anyone. Mom, I said, I am just refusing to hide the debris anymore. You built the house of cards. I just stopped blocking the wind. I didn't post the statement. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. A week later, I was invited to speak at the Cambridge Community Center in Harvard Square. It wasn't the prestigious university commencement stage. It was a local event, a gathering of social workers, community organizers, and students. The topic was civic engagement. The title of my talk was "Showing Up is Not a Slogan." The room was a converted gymnasium. Smelling faintly of floor wax and old coffee, there were about 200 metal folding chairs set up in rows. It was humble. It was real. I arrived early to check the sound system. As I was taping down a loose microphone cable, the back doors opened. 3 people walked in. They were not wearing their Sunday best. My father wore a gray sweater that looked slightly too large for him, as if he had shrunk in the wash. My mother wore no makeup, her face pale and lined with exhaustion that wasn't from jet lag. They didn't walk to the front. They didn't look for the VIP section. They didn't scan the room for photographers. They walked to the very last row, near the exit sign, and they sat down. They sat close together, shoulders touching, not out of affection, but out of a shared need for structural support. Brielle was not with them. I walked to the podium. I didn't acknowledge them. I didn't nod. I just adjusted the mic stand and waited for the room to settle. When I spoke, I didn't tell the story of the fund. I didn't mention the embezzlement or the Instagram posts or the years of neglect. I talked about the concept of the empty chair. We cannot demand to be loved, I told the audience, my voice echoing off the brick walls. Love is a gift, and sometimes, for reasons we cannot control, that gift is withheld. We cannot force people to care about us, but we can demand responsibility. We can demand that the people who claim to lead us, who claim to raise us, actually occupy the space they have been given. I looked at the back row. My parents were looking at their hands. I said that presence is a form of currency, and when you spend that currency on an image instead of a person, you end up bankrupt. I said that an empty chair is not just a piece of furniture, it is a breach of contract. At the very end of the speech, the local public access cameraman, sensing the weight of my gaze, panned his camera to the back of the room. He didn't know who they were. He just saw two middle-aged people in the back row who looked like they were carrying the weight of the world. On the monitor, I saw them. My father's head was bowed. My mother was wiping her eyes with a tissue. They weren't performing for the camera. They weren't smiling. They were just sitting there, absorbing the truth of what they had done. For the first time in 20 years, they were actually in the room. The applause was polite, thoughtful. When the event ended, I didn't go to the back row. I didn't offer absolution. I packed my notes and went to shake hands with the organizers. By the time I looked up again, the back row was empty. That night, I received a text message. It wasn't from my parents. It was from Brielle. There were no emojis, no hashtags, no excuses. I am sorry. She wrote, I am getting a job at a coffee shop in Charleston. I am going to pay for my own apartment. I will stand on my own. I didn't reply immediately. I let the words sit there. It was the first honest thing she had ever written to me. I set the terms for our reconciliation in an email the next morning. It was a contract, as binding as any legal document. I told them that I would not lend them money. I told them I would not use my name to rehabilitate their image. I told them that I would not lie for them. I said that trust is not a switch you flip. It is a house you build. Brick by heavy brick. And right now, they didn't even have a foundation. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me, it would be measured in time. It would be measured in phone calls that didn't ask for favors. It would be measured in showing up when there were no cameras. 2 weeks later, I packed the last of my things into a rental van. I had accepted a fellowship in Washington, D.C., working on policy for rural healthcare access. It was unglamorous, difficult work. It was exactly what I wanted. I drove out of Cambridge as the sun was setting, painting the brick buildings in shades of gold and fire. I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. The ghost was gone. The resentment was gone. I wasn't carrying the empty chair on my back anymore. When I moved into my new apartment in D.C., I bought a dining table. It was small, just big enough for 4 people. I bought 3 chairs, and then I bought a 4th one. I placed it at the head of the table. I didn't put a reserved sign on it. I didn't put flowers on it. I just left it there. It wasn't waiting for my parents. It wasn't waiting for Brielle. It was just a chair. It is a reminder that in my house, there is always space for someone to arrive, but they have to walk through the door themselves. They have to pull it out themselves, and they have to choose to sit down. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let me know which city or country you are watching this from. And tell me, who is the person you are going to show up for today? If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people who might need to hear it.